Good evening, everyone, and you're very welcome to our Junior Cycle Science webinar, where our Essential Science author team will look at ways to help students perform to their best of their ability at Junior Cycle Science. My name is Connor Walker, and I work with the post-primary publishing team, that's a mouthful, in Fowlands. And I'm delighted to have the Essential Science author team here this evening to step through different areas of the curriculum and the exam and how the new Essential Science teaching package supports success in junior cycle science. So just before I hand you over to Declan, I'll give you a brief overview of the running order. So during the session, we will start with Declan, who is our chemical world author, who will look at some of the question types that students are likely to encounter in the examination and how our assessment and exam guide supports knowledge reinforcement and exam preparation for that. Then Sean Finn, who is our physical world author, will then explore some of the other question types relating to graphs, data analysis and performing calculations, as well as some of the features of the Essential Science Teacher's Guide. Then I'm very happy to introduce our new Essential Science author, David O'Brien, who's worked on the biological world section of the book. And David will go through some of the key features and improvements in the textbook, as well as do a deeper dive into the exam paper and how the brand new assessment and exam guide aligns with its requirements. Then after that, we'll do a Q&A. So if anyone has any questions during the course of the webinar, feel free to drop them into the chat as we go, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. So we've got a fairly packed agenda, but we'll get to as many questions by the end and answer as many as is possible. We are recording this webinar, just to let you know, so we'll make that available shortly afterwards. And we will also email the PowerPoints tomorrow to everyone who's registered to this webinar. And also, please stay tuned to the very end after the author presentation when I'll give you some information about how you can get in touch with your local rep if you need sample copies of the new edition of Essential Science. So that's enough for me for now. I'll hand you over to Declan for the first part of the presentation. Best of luck, Declan.
Lovely. Great. Thanks very much, Connor. So if you could put on the next slide, please. And we'll throw in the ball. I suppose we're all well used to that saying in education, and I suppose it summarizes what we're trying to do here tonight. And one of the key points that we want to get across is how we can use marking schemes and reports from those who mark papers and who oversee the marking of papers, how we can help to use those points in our teaching. Next slide, please. And as you can see from this slide, the title of the publication is Assessment and Examination Guide. We have an increase in size, as you can see there, 258 pages. And in this assessment and exam guide, what we've tried to do is we've tried to summarize and synthesize all the lessons that we have garnered from marking schemes and chief examiners' reports into this workbook or assessment guide and examination guide. Next slide, please. Now, in this new publication, Chapter 41 is devoted exclusively to bringing students through some key points about the examination paper. It points out the various categories of questions and gives students lots of exam tips along the way. So, for example, on this page, we highlight the fact that students need to know the language of science in terms of scientifically correct language, i.e., they need to know their definitions. Next slide, please. This page emphasizes the importance of drawing labeled diagrams and labeling diagrams correctly. For example, the question there on activation energy was badly answered because some students didn't have the tip of the arrow touching the curve. So they need to have precision in what they draw. Similarly, at the bottom of that page, we show students that when they're drawing diagrams, simple black and white diagrams will get them full marks. but they must draw them with accuracy. So, for example, if they don't put the graduation marks in on the graduated cylinder looks like an ordinary gas jar. So again, marks are lost there. So accuracy in drawing diagrams is important. Next slide, please. This category of questions where students have to fill in blanks, and as you can see, for every category of question, we have exam tips. So the exam tip there is you won't lose any marks if you have a guess. Whereas if you leave a blank space there, you certainly won't get any marks. So if students are unclear, they should definitely have a guess. And as well as testing simple recall, this type of question also tests students' understanding. For example, the understanding of key terms. And if you look at that question at the bottom of the page, they have to pick out the correct terms to be filled into the blank space. So next slide, please. Now, as we move into the next category of questions, we tend to be moving a bit into the higher order thinking skills and asking students to move from simple recall into interpretation. So, for example, if you look at the question there, where they were asked students not only to identify parts of a diagram, but to interpret the different diagrams. So if you look at the two diagrams there at the bottom of the page, you'll see they have aluminium and chlorine, and they're asked why are they elements and which diagram represents a solid. So that tests the students' understanding of models used for the particulate nature of matter. Next slide. And I just want to spend a minute or two on multiple choice questions. There's a growing emphasis on multiple choice questions, not just in Ireland, but throughout the world, because there are a number of advantages to asking students to answer multiple choice questions. And what type of multiple choice questions are they asked to answer? Well, you can see there at the bottom of the page, a biology one, where they have to tick various boxes. Next slide, please. This is a visual way of representing multiple choice questions, and it represents the advantages of multiple choice questions insofar as it forces students to think and to move up into the higher order thinking skills of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And if I was asked to summarize in one sentence, what would I see as the main difference between the new specification and the old syllabus? I would say that in the new specification, there's an increased emphasis on higher order thinking skills, where students are asked to analyze and synthesize and evaluate information. Next slide, please. If we look at the 2024 examination paper, and on the next slide, we will see that there's quite an emphasis. There we see 5 questions, 5 multiple choice questions in the area of biology. Next slide, please. Here we see 3 multiple choice questions testing students' knowledge of the particulate nature of matter. Next slide, please. There we see 4 multiple choice questions testing students' knowledge of series and parallel circuits. And the next slide, please. You can see that there has been quite an emphasis, an increased emphasis on multiple choice questions. And in fact, I congratulate the SEC on this increased emphasis because it's in keeping with international best practice. And if you were to count up all the questions, we have 23 individual multiple choice questions on the 2024 examination paper. And when we held the CPD to discuss the marking schemes of the 2024 exam paper, one of the recommendations made by the examiner, who had marked several hundreds of these papers, was that students did not perform well on the MCQ questions. It was very clear they picked a choice, crossed it out, picked another choice, crossed it out, and so on. So we need to give students lots of practice. And that was one of the great advantages of us having the increased assessment skills book, because we can include lots and lots of practice. Multiple choice questions tend to be difficult to make out, but we've done all the groundwork for you. And before I leave this slide and hand over to Sean, the second big advantage, we saw the first big advantage of multiple choice questions is the higher order thinking skills. The second big advantage, of course, is that they help the teacher to diagnose misunderstandings. In other words, if students are getting mixed up between terms, for example, then you know you have to go back and tidy up their thinking and that. They're great for group work, that you can have two students working on multiple choice questions, trying to explain to each other why they think which one is the correct answer. And thirdly, of course, a great advantage of multiple choice questions is that they introduce differentiation into lessons. And when you're making out exam papers, you can have some simple multiple choice questions testing just recall, and ones then that test understanding and analysis and evaluation. So I'll hand over now to my colleague, Sean Finn. Thank you very much.
So on the next slide, we'll go into question 5. And these are questions about drawing graphs and interpreting graphs. And you'd have seen so many of these coming up in the exam papers over a period of time. And in the next slide, we'll see that in the examination and assessment guide, we've added even more graphs right throughout the assessment guide, not just in the chapter on graphs, but that students have to interpret graphs right throughout the whole course. And in the next slide, we'll see that, that is, as Declan said, we have model answers to some of the questions. And again, we're pointing out where students went wrong. When we spoke to people that actually corrected this exam paper, you know, they were saying that the arrow here had to point from the bottom of the line here right to the top of the curve. And then the next slide, we will find that we have a dedicated chapter, as we had in edition 1 and 2 and 3. And again, we're just building on our success with this by introducing more graphs right throughout the whole book. And we encourage you to dip in and out of this chapter as you go along. You might do simple graphs in first year, and you might do bivariate data maybe or something in second year. In the next slide, we will find that we have revised graphs throughout the book. So they're doing distance time graphs here. They're looking at what is the position of the person and what it means here in the graph. And then when we go to our actual experiments, we're using data logging, which is fantastic for teaching graphs. And the next slide, we'll find that that we look at the issues with graphs and the marking process. In many cases, charts were drawn. They get absolutely 0. Right, you need it when you're stating the relationship between the x and the y-axis. You need to make a relationship between that, and you must be able to predict what would happen under certain conditions. In the next slide, we'll find that we have plenty of opportunities to practice drawing and interpreting graphs right throughout the course. So here's one in biology about recovery time and heart rate. Again, here we've got one in chemistry where we have practice about rates, and here in physics again on arts and space where we'll be looking at acceleration due to gravity. And the next slide, we'll see that the next category of questions are questions that ask you to perform calculations. And when we're doing calculations here, so these are just examples here, worked examples. And the next slide, we'll find that throughout the book, we've got a method of doing these that we will discuss in a moment. So the chief examiner's report, he would observe that questions indicated that many candidates struggle to understand the use of compound scientific units. That's things like meters per second, etc. And there's recommendation that candidates should show their calculations more clearly. This is straight from the chief examiner's report. Calculations should be fully completed. An answer should not be left as 8/2. So this is calculating, I think, the resistance of a wire. And if they did 8/2, they got 0/6, right? And again, they have to give the units as well. So they have to not let it just like that. Even if they do it in the next slide, we'll see that we advise students to do it in a 3-step format, write the formula, fill in the formula, and write the answer with the correct unit. as you know, half the marks often are obtained by putting the correct unit. So if they showed their method and they wrote 10 here, it might be 5 out of 6 marks. It would be a mathematical slip. So again, we're writing the formula, filling the equation, and write the answer. Just to even for Leaving Cert students, this is very good practice. In the next slide, we will see that an appendix at the 8, there's a summary of all the equations that they need for this, and then the triangle method for using them for the different equations as well. And on the next slide, we'll find that the answers to all the numerical problems are in the teacher's guide. And the next slide, we will find that category 7 is questions that test students' knowledge of laboratory procedures and apparatus. So to this end, so again, we're telling people that the procedure should be numbered. Think of the steps you carried out in school when conducting an investigation. And again, the laboratory notebook gives them lots and lots of practice with writing these reports. Again, using keywords that you would as in your notebook, and again, including a label diagram in your answer where possible. In the next slide, we'll just see an example of this. Again, we're asking students to label and to follow things sequentially and to take their time over it, because a lot of marks can be obtained for this. And again, using keywords, etc., that we indicate right throughout the book are absolutely essential here. In the next slide, we will see that again, that we have these annotated diagrams for these experiments. These reduce cognitive load. So it's difficult if you've got to read a paragraph and go back to the picture and back to the paragraph and back to the picture. Here, everything is on the one page, and David will talk to this later, that it's much easier for students to understand this, maybe particularly with students with dyslexia. So you'll find that in chemistry and in physics and in biology as well. On the next slide, we will look at the dedicated laboratory notebook again. So this is very useful, obviously in your lab, but parallel to this, online, there are questions associated with the practical. So supposing you're finished your practical and you want a bit of time to finish the tidy up, students do most of it, but you do the end part, you can give them these, you can copy and paste them, put them in Google Classroom, decide what you want to do. It keeps them busy and reflecting about what they've done. In the next slide, right, we look at question 8. Questions that ask students to show a detailed understanding of certain requiring detailed answers. Okay, so certain concepts in science. And so again, we're asking people to use bullet points, underline keywords, use the keywords in your answer, and give as much detail as possible. So we give worked examples in the next slide. We'll find out that we have a worked example here. Again, this is discussing about digestion, and you have to do it step by step. Again, this is one on respiration. We're seeing it step by step, and these are past exam questions, and they need to think about this and they need a bit of practice in this, and particularly revising in third year. So the next slide, please. So questions that require students to read a short article and answer some questions in the article. On the next slide, we'll see that here we've got an article, and they've questions based to do with. This is an example from the Exams Commission, and again, we're giving exam tips about this. In some cases, the answer to the question is given in the article. Okay, so right throughout the book, so we'll see in the next slide that right throughout the book, we're giving you plenty practice at all these in every strand. Here's one on biology. Here's one on sustainability, that's Earth and space. The next one here is about data centers, and again, physics about nuclear energy. So on the next slide, we'll see that we're looking at the teacher's guide. So on the next slide, we'll see this, the contents of it, that each that we've looked at the nature of science, we've taken each strand, given a few hints and tips about things to look at. From our experience of teaching, we see what the misconceptions are out there. Again, laboratory organization and management, how you'd set up, what equipment you need to have, the chemicals required for it, which is very valuable, and then solutions to numerical problems, and examples of open-ended investigations for your experimental investigations, and then a scheme of work, which we'll look at the next slide. And in a moment, I'll hand over to David here, but just before this, we'll be looking at the recommended scheme of work here. We've covered it under a few headings. Again, the unit of work, the topic, Again, where you're going to find it in the textbook. And importantly, we're introducing nature of science gradually right through first year, second year, third year. Again, getting into things about fair tests. I find it difficult to start off in first year and go to the whole nature of science in one go when they haven't even done an experiment. So we're just introducing this bit by bit as we go along. Okay, so in the next slide now, I'll pass over to my colleague David, who will look at the biological world, and he will show how the 10 type of questions are integrated right throughout the biology, the whole strand, the whole book entirely, but more of a focus on biology, seeing as David has taken over the biology section. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Sean. So everybody, I work in a large community school where I teach students of all abilities. And, you know, the students that we all have in our classroom at the moment, their language ability across the country is different. So in this third edition of Essential Science, our textbook was written with the language level of our students in mind. So I'm going to take you through the key features of the textbook, bearing in mind the language level of the learners in front of us. So we'll start, Connor, with the next slide. And to begin with, every single page in the third edition of Essential Science is specifically designed to avoid information overload and to reduce the cognitive load on students. Next slide. We have an example there of the digestive system, and this the layout of the pages through illustrations really avoids too much information on our learners. Next slide, please. Again, there we have visually impactful, less information on the page. Next slide, please. And again, we have another example from biology with the menstrual cycle with the same features. Next slide, please. Secondly, every single diagram in the third edition of Essential Science is labelled with callouts. Callouts will help our students better understand the parts of specific diagrams, and as well as that, the function of each of the parts, rather than having paragraphs about them. We have one there, as you can see on the plant cell. It's labelled with callouts incorporating the roles of each of the organelles. Next slide, please. And we have one on photosynthesis. Next slide, please. And as well as that, the third feature in Essential Science is many of the learning outcomes that are in the specification can now be achieved by students in one page of our textbook. So, for example, one of the learning outcomes on the specification, it has yet to appear in the examination paper, so who knows when it could come up, is the interaction between the digestive, circulatory and respiratory systems. And we have all of that information and diagrams on one page, making it easier for students to achieve the specific learning outcome. Next slide, please. We have another example of achieving the learning outcome all on the one page about the medical, ethical and societal issues related to human reproduction. And this helps the learners in our classroom really, as you could say, tick off their learning outcomes and make sure that they've completed it fully so that they can be successful in their exam. Next slide, please. Key words throughout the book are not only highlighted, but the way in which key terms are presented are in a very clear manner, okay? Most of the sentences with keywords begin with that keyword at the start of the sentence: a cell, tissue, organ, system, so the students can immediately see the term that they're talking about. Next slide, please. And again, all of these key scientific terms are given at the start of every chapter. Next slide, please. Definitions are highlighted throughout the textbook, and students are regularly asked the meaning of scientific terms in the junior cycle science examination. Knowledge is regularly assessed on the paper, so students must know their definitions. Next slide, please. You can see the definition of a quadrat being 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter is 0.25 meters square, and that question actually came up in the 2024 examination paper. It was question 15, where they were asked to work out the area of a quadrat that with those measurements. So knowledge of definitions is essential. Next slide, please. The fourth feature of the third edition of Essential Science is that graphs are presented in a student-friendly manner. This layout of the graphs helps students better to notice trends and patterns, which of course they are expected to do in their exam. We have one there on the screen with different factors affecting the rate of photosynthesis. And through this easy, student-friendly layout of graphs, the work is done for you. You will now be able to better help your students in analysing graphs. Next slide, please. It's very important that this analysis takes place in our classroom, as in 2019, the Chief Examiner emphasised that students need to be able to, as Sean mentioned earlier, pick a graph. It had to be a line graph. They must choose appropriate scales and axes. They must notice trends and patterns, as I mentioned. You know, is the number of bubbles increasing, decreasing, or is it remaining constant? They must engage with bivariate data. That's very, very important. For example, the question came up in the junior search about the hardness of bread, and it was the white bread and the brown bread. That would be bivariate data that the Essential Science package can really help your students get experience of it. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, callouts are used for diagrams, but as well as that, experiments are summarized using illustrations. So no long instructions are involved. However, all of the necessary detail is still supplied, and these illustrations suit the learner. They're presented in a step-by-step manner, numbered, enabling the students to better understand the investigation. And as well as that, particular attention is placed, as you can see on the picture on the screen, on the nature of science. You can see the FAIR test, the independent variable and the dependent variable seamlessly integrated into all of our investigations. Next slide, please. Again, that's just another example of the photosynthesis one with the same point. Next slide, please. Exam tips are throughout the textbook of the third edition of Essential Science, and these are what we picked up from Chief Examiner's reports and from our experience of correcting the last 4 junior cycle science exams. Next slide, please. Recent examination questions and their model answers are provided at the end of chapters in the textbook. This edition has the most up-to-date recent examination questions available to the public. You can see examples on the screen of human health examination questions. Next slide, please. You will see microbiology past examination question. Next slide, please. As you know, every question in the examination paper is accompanied by an image, and we've included plenty of stimulus material or stimulus imagery, which are top quality images, the same type of which they will encounter in the exam. But of course, in the exam, it will be an unfamiliar context. So the more stimulus imagery that is provided to students through the Essential Science package that you will implement in your classrooms, the better prepared your students will be. Next slide, please. And again, we have some more stimulus imagery. Thank you. Next slide, please. It's essential that students are clear on the nature of science. Throughout the textbook, we have seamlessly integrated forming hypothesis. Next slide, please. Justification of answers based on a hypothesis came up in 2023. Next slide, please. Variables, controls, carrying out background research, identifying what a research question is. We have dedicated chapters to the nature of science, carrying out investigations appropriately. Next slide, please. Here we have an exam question from 2024, and A, B, C, and D was all about the nature of science. It was an experiment in an unfamiliar context about cress seeds, but it was essential that they were clear on that unifying strand. Next slide, please. Accuracy and precision is seamlessly introduced into every investigation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That's just our text on precision. And as you can see, in 2024, we have 3 multiple choice questions on question 12, and they were all related to accuracy and precision. Next slide, please. Again, this is using the nature of science, analyzing graphs, picking an appropriate graph, and coming to conclusions. Next slide, please. From 2024 again, do the results support your hypothesis? Our students need experience like that, and the Essential Science textbook and assessment guide prepare your students thoroughly for this type of questions. Next slide, please. As Sean mentioned earlier, our scheme of work seamlessly integrates the nature of science related to every single chapter. So this will really benefit you in passing on to your students the skills of that strand. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you through now the vast revamp that we've undertaken in the assessment and examination guide. Next slide, please. Every chapter in the assessment and examination guide now contains additional exam style questions. So all of the successful questions that were in previous editions of Essential Science, 2nd edition, are still there. We have now added a plethora of questions to every single chapter in biology, chemistry, physics, and earth and space. And every single chapter has a multiple of those 10 categories of questions that Sean and Declan mentioned. And that's what I'm going to show you. Next slide, please. So this is on the cell. We have the previous questions, which were end of chapter questions on the left-hand side. And this is just one of 4 pages of exam style questions on the cell. You can see we've calculation questions on top. We have closed fill in the blanks in tables, number 2. We have labeling parts and diagrams, and we've multiple choice. So every category of question that comes up in the junior cert or in the junior cycle is in every chapter in the assessment and exam guide. Next slide, please. The same applies to digestion. We've a closed test. We've labeling diagrams. Next slide, please. And more for the digestive system, we have data analysis, because it's very important that I know I'm only taking you through biology, but biological investigations, of course, involve data collection and data analysis. And we need to get our students to practice biology data analysis. And this would really help you do that in your classrooms. Next slide, please. Again, we have the circulatory system, labeling diagrams. We have graphs in biology in the circulatory systems. We've predictions. Next slide, please. And again, data analysis in biology is essential about the pulse rate. Next slide, please. And here we have respiration. Again, this is just the respiratory system, just an example about detailed answers. Remember when Sean was talking about that question on describe how the piece of bread was digested and absorbed. Again, we're trying to give students practice of writing paragraph length answers, as the chief examiner in 2019 recommended to us. Next slide, please. Identifying relationships between variables is key for junior cycle students. You can see the bell jar model came up in an exam, getting them to analyze it, getting them to predict the relationship between pressure and volume in an unfamiliar context. Those skills will help your students succeed. Next slide, please. The nature of science is included in the exam style questions as well. We have a full page there. We've fill in the blanks. We've a paragraph length answer, and we've investigation questions. Next slide, please. And again, a full page of biology, respiration, data analysis, coming to conclusions using the nature of science skills. Plenty of practice. Next slide, please. The same for photosynthesis, as I've just said. Next slide, please. And again, just another example of top quality question in the assessment guide. Next slide, please. We have, again, a full page for human reproduction, multiple pages. This is just one example of exam-style questions. Next slide, please. And writing detailed answers, as I said, key skill recommended by the 2019 Chief Examiner. Next slide, please. Inheritance and variation, more exam-style questions. Next slide, please. A full page about interpreting diagrams has come up in the exam in 2019 about sickle cell anemia, gives your students the practice with this essential science package. Next slide, please. The article-based questions that Sean mentioned, loads of practice here, just one example about evolution. Next slide, please. And the same again for evolution. We've writing detailed answers, we've analysing diagrams in unfamiliar contexts, what they need to be able to do. Next slide, please. An example from human health, we've fill in the blanks. We have investigation type questions. They're given data. They must identify variables. Why is it a fair test, etc.? Why isn't it? Why isn't it? What conclusion can you come to? Next slide, please. Again, the same with microbiology. The same styles is repeated. 10 categories, all categories of questions in every single chapter to prepare the students for the exam. Next slide, please. And again, for the habitat study, and you know, this is what came up in 2024. They were asked to analyze data based on the percentage frequency method. Next slide, please. The final biology chapter is, of course, conservation of biodiversity and getting students to write detailed answers, asking them for their opinion. Do you agree or disagree? You might remember the one about in 2019, it was about mice. It was about feeding mice fatty acids and exposing them to stress. Was this ethical or not? We need to give them experience of justifying their answers. Next slide, please. So just to emphasize, all of that, what I've gone through, is repeated for every chapter in the Assessment Skills Guide for chemistry. Next slide, please. And the same for physics. That looks absolutely outstanding. And next slide, please. The same for Earth and Space. So before I pass you over to Conor, just to reinforce again, 10 categories of questions, give them plenty of practice, and there's a vast range of questions in the assessment and exam guide, which can really help your students succeed. Over to you, Conor.
That's great. Thanks, David. Thanks, David. Thanks, Declan. Thank you, Sean, for such an informative presentation. I thought we'd be really up against the clock given how much content we had to get through, but you've done really well. So thanks for helping us to keep the time. Before we get to the Q&A, I just wanted to mention a few things. So first of all, this webinar ties in with the publication, as you will have seen, of the new 3rd edition of Essential Science, which builds on the success that we've had, which we're so grateful for, of the 2nd edition of Essential Science. So you can find out more about it and the things that the guys have showcased here this evening by going to folens.ie, and there's a website program page available where you can access the flip books of the textbook and the assessment and exam guide and various other digital resources as well. To speak a little bit more just about the online resources, I know that Declan, Sean and David mentioned specifically that a lot of the things related to the print resources, but in addition to that, we've also got a wide range of online resources as part of the teaching package. So that includes things like ebooks, where we have samples available on folens.ie if you want to take a look at the books. We have a full range of improved or revamped PowerPoint teaching slides for every chapter, PDFs of additional revision and experiment questions. We've got the teacher's guide, which is printed but also available online, and then the schemes of work, which David and Sean would have shown, are also available as editable files online. The videos include a full range of student experiment videos, which are a great resource because they help to ensure the essential lab skills that students need are known before they carry out any investigations. And in addition to that, just across the bottom, you'll see some screenshots of some carefully researched recommended videos from the likes of YouTube. And also to mention that one of the updates to the laboratory lab book is that we have added QR codes, which allow students to easily access the experiment videos directly from their book to their phones. This is just a slide that hopefully gives a sense or will help me to explain the brand new teaching slide PowerPoints that we've developed for each chapter of Essential Science. So you'll see in the top left there's a strong emphasis or a stronger emphasis on keywords where we set them out clearly at the beginning of each presentation, but we also then have quizzes and tests at the end that test students' knowledge of those keywords and their definitions. Top right shows how we provide links from within our teaching slides to the various videos that I mentioned earlier on YouTube. And we also provide links on the bottom left as an example to our experiment videos with the QR code should you wish to use them in your class. And they can also be played directly from within the PowerPoint. And also useful, we hope, given that there's such an emphasis or importance, I suppose, on being exam ready by the end of third year. All of our slides contain exam sections at the end that present related exam questions from the SEC examination papers. And then before we jump into the Q&A, and I know that this is primarily about junior cycle, this is just to let you guys know, in case you are wondering, that we're really excited to announce that we have new publications for the new curriculum specifications for chemistry and physics coming out later this year. So we have a brand new edition of Chemistry Live, authored by Ryan Gallagher. We're delighted who's joining Declan as co-author in that book. So that's fantastic. And we're really excited about that. And we also have a brand new edition of Real World Physics, which is authored by Dan O'Regan and Robert Nolan. Also, just to confirm that we will be publishing for biology in 2026. That book will be available in that year. And we'll be at the ISTA conference. So if you have any questions over the weekend about these books, or if you have any ideas or thoughts or things that you'd like to see in a publication for a new Leaving Certificate, please do come by, let us know, and we'd love to speak to you then. And this is to let you know as well that if you wanted to access or get your hands on a sample copy of Essential Science, the best thing to do is to get in touch with your local Folens rep. So they're available for calls or appointments at any time that suits you, with resources that will support all of your classroom needs. And they have they're well informed on the upcoming book scheme. So if you have any issues or concerns around that, they can answer any questions and they can arrange a sample for you. So you can do that by going to folens.ie. And if you enter I think there's like a search for rep, or even if you just select your school roll number or enter your school name on the form that's provided, then you will be able to, it'll put you in connection with your local rep, contact them and they can answer any questions that you might have. Okay, so we're going to go to the Q&A section. So just to remind people that we have the chat is open, and if you have any questions that you like to ask, please post them. But I'll start maybe with the first question that's come in, which relates to the multiple choice question. So this reads, and maybe Declan, you could take this because you spoke a little bit about the multiple choice questions. I intend to put more emphasis in my teaching on MCQs. I have never heard of these concept cartoons before. And could you just maybe help to explain what they are or provide some more information on them?
Oh, yeah, grand. The concept cartoons were developed by two teachers in the UK, Stuart Naylor and Brenda Keogh. I wonder, could you show the slide, Connor, that I had at the beginning?
Yeah.
There's a URL at the end of that. And you can get these concept cartoons. They set up a small little company, the two of them. And if you go onto that website, maybe that link could be put in the chat. Would that be possible? And you can buy a whole set of PowerPoints and PDFs. I would suggest if you're buying them, just buy the online resources because the printed book isn't as good as the online. Uh, as far as I remember, I think they cost, you get a whole load of PowerPoints for about £30 sterling or something. But they're really good. I always encourage my own student teachers to make use of them in their teaching. It's great to get group work involved, or if you just want to pose a question to the class. So you have lots of PowerPoint slides, and I just took one of them. So if you were teaching about say insulation, there, that's a good example. Okay, so well recommended.
Thank you. And again, as I mentioned, we will make these slides available to everyone, so you'll be able to access the link that way. Have I just jumped out of the presentation? I'll just show it again, just in case. Oops. Just forward to the Q&A. Declan, this is more a question actually from me before I jump into the chat again. Just to do with the common level course. I know that previously, well, before curriculum reforms happened, the junior cycle, science was higher level and ordinary level. Now we have a common level course, and with that, I suppose, throws in challenges around the teaching the common level course very often to a classroom of mixed ability. So I don't know whether Sean or David or Declan, whether you would like to maybe speak to that a little bit and to your own approach to how to tackle that challenge, perhaps teaching a common level course in classes where you have ranges of ability.
Yeah. Well, maybe if I just mention one or two things, and then I could hand over to Sean and David. You may recall when we were talking about multiple choice, I said one of the advantages of multiple choice is in the area of differentiation. And in fairness to the SEC, they tried to do this, especially in the first part of the paper, where a lot of the questions suit students who may be struggling. A lot of them would be just recall, and the more analytical type questions testing the higher order thinking skills are in the second part. So I always suggest to my own student teachers to have a variety in their lesson plans of questions and topics that are suitable for what we would call the ordinary level students, and also for the higher level students. But perhaps David or Sean might have some ideas.
Yeah, so I suppose right throughout the book, we've put questions in that are graded. We'd have started off with easy recall questions, going on to questions that look for analysis and synthesis later on. So there's something there for everybody. So yeah, absolutely. Right through it, again, with the annotated diagrams, it just helps to reduce the cognitive load, and with plenty good quality diagrams, it makes it more accessible to students that might find science a bit more difficult. That's it.
Yeah, just to add in there, because of the common level, and we have such a range of abilities in our classrooms, help your students, first of all, begin by noticing trends and noticing patterns, and students can do that through the clear layout, the student-friendly graphical analysis, and then build it up to justifying their answers with scientific reasoning through the detailed answer questions. So as Sean said, the question categories are scaffolded. So by starting on one type, it will subsequently lead into the other. Thanks, Conor.
Yeah, and I suppose our plan of work takes this into account as well, where we're introducing the nature of science bit by bit instead of overloading them at the start when they have very little experience, maybe doing practical work. So we've thought out from our experience, we've thought of what the more difficult parts, we've left it a little bit later in the course. Thanks, Conor.
No problem. We have a question from one teacher just to explain that they're using the second edition, that's Elaine, for their students, and will be using the third edition for incoming first years next year. Will the digital resources be available before the next academic year? They'll be all ready and available for the new edition, for the third edition, and they'll be finalized over the summer. So will they be ready for the start of the next academic year? For now, it's the second edition resources that are available. If you're using a mix of the second and the third edition, both sets of resources will be available to you. Just another question there, just on Chemistry Live samples being available. I suppose we're just, with respect to that and to physics, we're just awaiting the sample SEC examination papers. I suppose we want to just assess and cross-reference what we've authored against the questions in that, and to ensure that everything is aligned with that, and the content that we have in the book is aligned with what will be expected in the exam. So once that's done, then we'll be in a position maybe to confirm when samples will be available. But it's very much about getting things right, I think, before we publish, you know, and that's the position that we're taking with that. Okay, that's fantastic. We can answer questions then about, you know, more about essential science, chemistry, physics, biology at the conference on Saturday. So if anybody's there, as I said, please feel free to call by, say hello, and it'll be good to talk to you. But I think that pretty much wraps things up. I'm conscious of time as well, so we're pushing, you know, just beyond 10 to 8, and you know, there's a little bit left of daylight and an evening to be enjoyed there. So I think we'll finish it there. But thank you very much, Declan, Sean and David, for such a detailed and practical presentation. I think you covered a lot of ground with respect to not only what's in the new teaching package, but I think beyond that, you know, a deeper dive into the examination and the type of questions that students are expected to answer. I thought was very, very thoughtful. So we covered a lot of ground, and I hope that the people attending this evening found that useful. And to that, I'd just like to thank everybody here, to all the teachers who've taken the time to join us here this evening. We know it's an especially busy time of the school year, so we really appreciate you joining us and engaging with us during the session. I mentioned earlier, folens.ie is the website to go to search for any information that you might want, or if you want to connect with your local rep. But, you know, if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to provide any additional support as you kind of move towards the end of the year and you make decisions around book lists and so on. So for now, I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thanks again for being part of today's webinar, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care.